I'll just open by saying I was at the 2016 Royal Society meeting that Dennis put together, and I did not know Dennis personally back then. And then there was probably 20 ID guys that were in that crowd, and I had some conversations with them. And I feel like there's a considerable amount of common ground. For example, I think everybody in the room believes that science can be done a lot better if we approach it with different presuppositions, and that our medical system is failing in some very important areas because we have gotten some things wrong. And both of you care about getting those things right. So there's a lot in common. And so let's just turn this conversation loose and see where it goes. And who wants to begin?
That's fine by me, Perry. And I'm very happy to see just where the conversation goes. But you probably know the work of Casey better than me. But that sort of implies Casey might begin.
I just want to say to both of you, I'm really grateful to have this conversation. Perry, thank you for proposing this and paying attention to what folks in both camps, or whatever you want to call it, are saying. You're a bridge here who is trying to do good and just connecting people that have some common ideas, maybe not 100%, but I really appreciate your heart behind that, Perry, and I see that and I really recognize that. And Dennis, I am so grateful to be talking to you. I've listened to your lectures and read your material for years. And so it's fine if you haven't read anything of mine. I wouldn't have expected that, but I just want you to know that I'm a fan, and I've definitely read your material for a long time, and your papers, your lectures, your on YouTube, and also your books. I was going to do a lot more rereading of your material over the last week, except I didn't have power for 4 of the last 6 days. So it became an interesting week, but we got through it. We're fine now, and that's just how life goes sometimes. But so I just want to say thank you to both of you for being willing to have this conversation. And Dennis, I really do admire your willingness to go and outside the box and to talk to people who maybe you would not normally interact with. I really admire and respect that as well. And that just says a lot about you, and I'm grateful for that. But so as I was going through reading as much material as I could, preparing for this, I realized that there was a need for a Venn diagram. And I would like to say that it was inspired by Dennis's 2017 paper that had a really nice Venn diagram showing the third way versus Neo-Darwinism. I think this was your paper in Interface Focus. But I actually, oh, sorry?
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But the truth be told is that I made the Venn diagram before I reread that paper. I didn't actually get to that paper until this morning, and I started the Venn diagram last night. But I was very glad to see that there was some intersection, no pun intended, between your Venn diagram and my Venn diagram. And so I thought maybe I was on the right track. So this is a really ugly, messy Venn diagram that has Neo-Darwinism, third way evolution, and intelligent design. And I don't know, it's probably too grotesque to show this thing because it's just so big and ugly, but I can at least read some of the intersections that I found between the different. All right, so let me.
Not by me, yes.
Okay, so let me make sure this is going to project on the right monitor here. So there's my Venn diagram. Okay, and again, it is a little bit the scribblings of a madman here. So you've got a big Neo-Darwinism circle, a big third way circle, and a big ID circle. This is actually a very large PowerPoint template that I used for making posters during my PhD research. So it's like an A0 sized format PowerPoint template. So we can zoom in a little bit here. But you can see that there are things that all 3 viewpoints agree with. Life is complicated. Life has a history. Random mutation, natural selection are real forces at work in biology. And natural selection does cause changes in allele frequencies within populations. And microevolution, what we might define as small-scale change within a species or fine-tuning a pre-existing function, that certainly occurs, okay? So Neo-Darwinism, of course, has its sort of standalone views in this sort of blue zone. DNA is a self-replicator. All genetic variation is random. The Weissman barrier protects the egg and the sperm from being affected by changes to the body. The central dogma prevails. You have a one-way transmission of information from DNA to protein, and that's the end point. And I found some nice quotes here. New variation arises only through random variation, inheritance through DNA, natural selection is the sole cause of adaptation. Evolution, as Darwin said, must proceed by numerous successive slight modifications. And macroevolution is that gradual adding up of slight microevolutionary point mutations or small-scale variations till something big finally shows up. Genes are primary causal agents. They're selfish. You find Neo-Darwinists who don't want to use terms like purpose or function. Even they don't want to use the word function. Like, they don't want to say that the heart is for pumping blood. They want to avoid that kind of language. There's a lot of literature that says that. They certainly don't want agency or teleonomy or teleology in biology. And the fitness landscapes always have to be very smooth, right? You got to be able to climb Mount Improbable under all cases. They also tend to say that the genome is chock full of junk DNA due to random mutations and lots of selfish replicators that are doing their thing and filling the genome with copies of themselves like Agent Smith in The Matrix. And organisms are facing similar, where does convergence come from? They would say that's from organisms facing similar selection pressures. I think that's always an interesting question. So I'm sure there's much more than this, but this is just what I came up with. Where does Neo-Darwinism and third way evolution intersect? And of course, Dennis or anybody, feel free to chime in if I've made a mistake or missed something big, okay? I want to get this right. The last thing I want to do is misrepresent or misstate anybody's view. I'm doing my best here, but I make mistakes. I want to get this right. So please feel free to correct me. But what are some similarities? I think that ultimately I would say that third way evolutionists would say that life is the result of materialistic evolution. And that does involve purely materialistic causes all the way down. There's no intelligent design. A third way and Neo-Darwinists would both say that Darwin was right in saying that natural selection is the driving force behind evolution, not the only cause. Third way would certainly say that natural selection is not the only cause, but it's a major important force. And natural selection is a purposeless, goalless process. So life evolved by Darwinian evolution, a purposeless and goalless process. Certainly both camps would say that common ancestry is true and that macroevolution has occurred and does occur. But of course, I would say that third way evolution has its own, where it's very critical of Neo-Darwinism. And some of these might also be...
Can I just interrupt you there?
Yeah, please, by all means.
Please, briefly, because I was following your overlap between Neo-Darwinism and third way. I would change a few of those. Would it be good if I just explained that before we carry on?
Please.
Yes. This is very good because Venn diagrams like this have a lot that can help, and I can read it easily too. Yes. First thing I would want to correct is that Darwin slowly during his life came to the view that natural selection is not the driving force. That may surprise you. And the evidence is crystal clear. I'm writing an article at the moment on it. His 1871 book, The Descent of Man and Sexual Selection, it was actually a 2-volume book originally. He published those separately, makes it very clear that he is in favour of another force driving evolution, which he calls sexual selection. I would call it social selection, but whatever you call it, it is intentional, conscious selection. It's totally not natural selection. So that would be one point, but these are ways in which you could modify your diagram easily. I can, if necessary or if desirable after this discussion, I could send you in confidence a draft of that article. I think it's a very important one because the division between Neo-Darwinism and people like me occurred in 1866, as long ago as that, between Wallace and Darwin. They fundamentally disagreed about the role of natural selection. But there it is. I can send that if it helps you. It would enable you to fine-tune this diagram. Natural selection is a purposeless, goalless process. But there's something very funny about this. The environment is largely other organisms. Once you give other organisms intention and purpose, the environment is very purposeful. And I don't know what to make of this. Darwin did not spot this. I have to say that. But it's important, nevertheless, to realize that he was on the way to realizing that even what he defined as natural selection, it would only apply in a dead world if there were some organisms living with no other organisms there. Because once he's given other organisms purpose and intention, he cannot say the environment is neutral. Anyway, that's that one. Yes, common ancestry is true, correct, yes. And macroevolution has occurred and does occur. Not quite sure what that means. Some Neo-Darwinists were very opposed to Eldridge and Gould on saltatory evolution, but that's a minor point. My key point here is that I think that Darwin was very clear that in his view purpose was important. That's the one essential thing I want to get in at this point. But back over to you.
No, I've really gathered that from watching some of your lectures and reading some of your material, Dennis, that you think that you're reclaiming Darwin with third way evolution, yes, and that the Neo-Darwinists have really diverged from him. And I really like that.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Yes.
Yeah. And I like that about the third way view. I think Darwin was a very good scientist. Darwin has this very famous quote where he says that a correct result can only be found by stating and balancing the full facts and arguments on both sides of each question. And I've often said that the Neo-Darwinists, unfortunately, they often don't let other folks look at the full picture, and they don't really follow Darwin's own advice about how to do science. And I sometimes have said that Darwin is rolling over in his grave based upon how some of his latter-day defenders really don't let there be an open scientific conversation. And yeah, so I like the way you do that. That's really helpful, everything you just said, and I certainly would recognize, sexual selection is an important force for Darwin's view. And yeah, you're right, Wallace saw things. We in some ways are more in the tradition of Wallace. Also, I would even argue that Wallace saw opportunities for an intelligent purpose, intelligent design in some ways. It's a very teleological form of evolution, but he thought that there was an intelligent guidance in some, maybe not necessarily your traditional theistic worldview, but he thought that there was some room for that. Yeah. So ID folks, we like Wallace, and there's a guy in our community named Michael Flannery. He's done some very good work in that department. But so certainly you would say that the gene-centric view of Neo-Darwinism, and this is from actually Leyland et al.'s paper in Nature. Fails to capture the full gamut of processes that direct evolution. Missing pieces include how physical development influences the generation of variation, developmental bias, how the environment directly shapes organisms, traits, that would be plasticity, how organisms modify environments, niche construction, how organisms transmit more than genes across generations, extragenic phenomena are just outcomes of evolution. And this is, of course, all part of the extended evolutionary synthesis, where Neo-Darwinism views those as just interesting things that happen, but the third way view says, no, these are actually important causes of how evolution can go forward. So that's a big difference between you guys and them. Other important forces in evolution. I loved your paper, by the way, with James Shapiro, where you talked about how all of these interesting evolutionary mechanisms are just missing from the Neo-Darwinian literature. It's like where they're not even acknowledging it. So other important forces include symbiogenesis, natural genetic engineering, organismal stress that activates intrinsic genomic change operators, macroevolution by genome restructuring, which is different from that sort of gradual accumulation of changes. So that paper you wrote with James Shapiro was very helpful, as far as I'm recommending this to anybody who's watching this in the future, of course. It's a very helpful paper to understand the third way view. So this means, though, that evolution doesn't have to proceed. It can proceed by numerous successive slight modifications. I think we all agree that is a possible mode, but certainly third way would say it doesn't have to proceed in that manner. And developmental bias plus natural selection explains convergence. And that's a very important point. How do you get convergent evolution? There is bias to go in certain directions, because I love when Simon Conway Morris says that convergence is ubiquitous. among organisms. It's found everywhere. ID finds that very interesting as well. I think we have a slightly different take on that, why that is. But I really appreciate that the third way view is interested in the frequency and the commonality of convergence. I think that it's interesting that third way says that macroevolution often occurs by major chromosomal rearrangements. And talking about fitness landscapes, how do the different views view the fitness landscapes? As we said, Neo-Darwinism has to have these smooth fitness landscapes. Feel free to correct me if I'm not getting this quite right. It seems to me that the third way view would say that fitness landscapes can be smooth, but they can also be rugged in some cases. Yes, but macro mutations, these major chromosomal rearrangements might be able to give you massive jumps in complexity to get you up the rugged cliffs of a fitness landscape. Is that right, Dennis? Would that be fair?
That's right. Yes, I go along with that, Casey. I would only add that one has to remember that it only needs a few organisms in a species to get the right combination of those rearrangements for the way forward to be clear. And some of the Neo-Darwinist objections to that are, it's extremely improbable. That's fine. If there are 1 million organisms in a species, it only takes 2 or 3 to get the right answer. That, incidentally, is how our immune systems work. They ask the B cells to produce millions of new possible immunoglobulins. Only one might work. That is all that's necessary. That's the point. So I would fine-tune that a bit, but essentially that's correct, yes.
Sure, and this is, I think, going to be a really interesting point of conversation that maybe we can get to later. I think that ID would have a different take on the probabilistic resources. I think your immune system example is a really interesting one I'd like to come back to. And whether or not the adaptive immune system and generating antibodies, is that a good metaphor or maybe representation of what can happen in nature? I'm going to give you all that for now. I want to come back to it. And of course, you've talked a lot about how stochasticity is a vital factor which life harnesses to function, evolve, and thrive. And I think this is interesting. I think there's actually a lot of, I think that's an area where we need to explore that more. And that goes for both ID, third way evolution, and folks in the engineering world who do biomimetics. That how can our engineers better use fuzzy logic to make better technology and basically mimicking the way life harnesses stochasticity. I think some of that is already happening. We were talking about this with some colleagues. You've got a cell phone, and your cell phone maybe has a weak connection to one cell tower, and as it's moving along, it's going to use sort of stochasticity and fuzzy logic to try to find the best signal. But there's a lot of competing signals and information there. You got to sift through those competing signals and the noise to find the best way forward. So I think that technology is getting more and more like life in that regard. One thing I really like about the third way evolutionary view, and this is a rhetorical point, is that you guys, I think, have more freedom to critique Neo-Darwinism because nobody thinks that you're supporting intelligent design. So you guys can get away with speaking truth on this issue. And I really like that. And if I put that in here, I think that's a really important point. And I say more power to you on that point right there. I appreciate your boldness in being willing to critique Neo-Darwinism. So how are we doing here? Do we want to pause at all?
Just a brief comment on that. It is a fundamental misunderstanding by the Neo-Darwinists that the third way view is that we substitute one set of certainties for their set of certainties. We don't substitute any certainties whatsoever. And I don't think they've understood that. They would like to pin us down and say, in effect, to us, okay, what is the set of truths, if you want to call them those, that now define what evolution should be defined to be? And our reply to that is, let it evolve. Let us find out. Let us, for God's sake, be open to what it might be that we discover. And they're so fundamental to the mentality of third way that I find it very difficult to understand why at least the Neo-Darwinists I've argued with, and that includes quite a number of them now, don't seem to understand that. We're not trying to set one dogma up against another. And that's absolutely fundamental. And the freedom to critique is not only critique Darwinism, but to critique anything to do with the processes by which evolution can occur. We have to retain that freedom. I have a small group of young people who interact with me, around a dozen of them, and the thing they desperately want is not to be cased in. They don't want anybody to close what it is they can investigate. So I love that part of your more freedom point in the third way part of the diagram. Yes, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but
no, you're not interrupting. You're saying great. I don't want to interrupt you. You're saying great things. Who is it, Max Planck, who said that scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time? Not in a violent sense. It's just folks who get set in their ways need young minds to come in and come up with new ideas. So we have a similar experience in the ID community. We really invest a lot in young up-and-coming scientists. We expose them to some of your ideas, Dennis, as well, from the third way and also the ID view, and they love this stuff. So I agree with you 100%. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Everything you're saying, I'm just more power to you, Dennis. That's all I can say. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So,
okay. Fine.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but it's skipping my mind here. But anyway, so let's start to get into the ID realm here a little bit. So let's look at some of the overlaps between the third way evolution and intelligent design. And I remember what I was going to say. One of the points I really appreciate, and this came from Philip Ball's book, from your work, that life is dizzyingly complicated. And we also agree very much with that. And I loved how you always point out, and Philip Ball says this as well, and believe it or not, we fully agree with this, that life is not just a machine or a computer. Life is not a machine or a computer because it's more complex than anything human technology has ever made. But it is true, and Philip Ball says this, there are some things you will find in life that can look like machine-like structures or can take on certain computer-like features. But that does not mean that it's appropriate to say that a cell is a machine or a cell is a computer or life is a machine or a computer. We fully agree with that. And so when you're talking just now about following the evidence where it leads and not substituting dogma in, I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like it is the tendency of the Neo-Darwinists to always want to have a set of predefined dogmas. And we all just want to follow the way that our motto in the ID community is let's follow the evidence where it leads. And I feel like in the third way community, you guys also see things in a similar way. We don't want to have predefined outcomes. We want to say, yes, natural selection is a real force, but what else is going on? And so actually, at this point, let's talk about your diagram from your 2017 paper.
I think. Yes.
Yeah. So this really shows what you just talked about. You don't want to have a limiting set of dogmas. And you also want to take what works from Neo-Darwinism. We want to talk about Mendelian inheritance, population genetics, speciation, contingency, Darwinism, variation, natural selection. But you want to say that's not all that's going on. What you reject from Neo-Darwinism is when they say only, this is the only way it can work. No, you want to say this is one way it can work, but there's other forces at work as well. We in the ID community take exactly the same approach. We're not denying that natural selection can do many things. We also want to look at many of the third way forces that you guys have discovered, things like natural genetic engineering, symbiosis. Where can it work? What can it do? But I'll be honest, we're going to say there might be some limits to what it can do. But we think it's really exciting to discover these new evolutionary capacities. And we may have slightly different takes. We might say, for example, here's something that ID says. Natural genetic engineering, yes, it occurs. And yes, epigenetic changes occur, but often for the purpose of tuning pre-existing features along predefined axes, allowing for rapid and pre-programmed adaptational abilities. So we're really excited to read books like James Shapiro's Evolution for the 21st Century and find out what natural genetic engineering can do. I'll be honest, I'm going to disagree, I think, with that maybe can do quite as much as Professor Shapiro thinks. And Perry, when you say in your book that natural genetic engineering and evolution 2.0, which also I agree with a lot of the stuff in that book, but I don't think that natural genetic engineering is going to produce a flagellum. I think that's going to require something else. But anyway, so let's just look at the similarities here. Gene centrism has yielded little biomedical fruit. I apologize for having to squint our eyes here. Can I zoom in a little bit? Yeah, okay, I can zoom in. Good, here we go. Gene centrism has yielded. So we agree here that we got to get rid of gene centrism if we want to understand biology, you want to make better progress in solving medical problems.
Exactly. And for all, that's right, and for all except the monogenetic diseases. Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
No, I'm just adding that it's yielded almost zero biomedical fruit in the case of the polygenic diseases, and its only application, it seems to me, possibly, but not with great success yet, is in the monogenetic diseases. Yes, I'm just adding that little bit of rider to what you've written there.
No, absolutely right. And there's no question there are some genetic diseases. My wife and I have very close friends with a young boy who has a particular mutation that he doesn't speak. He speaks a little bit. Actually, they said he would never speak, and they said he would never walk, and they said he would never really have high cognition. But as he grows older, he's defying the odds, and it just shows that there's other forces besides just the genome. He has this mutation, but he's grown beyond what his disease is supposed to allow. So there's other things going on here. But anyway, I remember the Human Genome Project. This is going to solve all these diseases, and you guys talk about this in your literature. But where have these promises, they haven't borne out? Yeah. We also agree that Neo-Darwinism lacks a good theory of the generative. Gerd Muller talked about this at the conference that you organized in 2016, the Royal Society Conference, which I'm not going to say was endorsing intelligent design. It was not, but certainly there were some good criticisms of Neo-Darwinism there. But here's a big intersection between third way and ID, that there is purpose, function, and agency in biology. You can call it teleonomy or teleology. 100%. This is where ID and third way are really holding hands together, I think. And also this idea that all genetic variation must be random. We don't agree with that. We would agree that the genome matters, but it isn't everything. We can't be reduced to our genes. Genome is read-write, not just read-only memory. Totally agree with that. We also agree with you that there's a lot less junk DNA than was originally thought. I did a debate with a Rutgers evolutionary biologist earlier in 2024 named Daniel Stern Cardinale on the question of junk DNA. I think he's probably a sort of a standard neo-Darwinist. I don't want to speak for him, but he certainly comes across like that, and he certainly was very much arguing that even now, after post-ENCODE, most of the genome is junk. And I think that we would agree that there's still a lot to learn about the genome, but there's a lot more junk DNA than we thought, and ENCODE has shown that vast portions of the genome are functional. We agree Neo-Lamarckian inheritance occurs. We agree that there's a lot, this is a huge another area of agreement with intelligent design. And if Dennis, if you have not read some of our papers, which that's fine if you haven't, I'd be happy to send you some of these to talk about this, that there's much biological information that resides outside the genome, information in the egg, information in embryonic electric fields, epigenetic tags.
Exactly. Yes. So far, so good.
Okay, great. And it can often be inherited through extragenetic inheritance. Jonathan Wells, a molecular biologist in our community who sadly just passed away about 2 months ago. He wrote a wonderful paper in 2014 looking at all these, what he calls ontogenetic information that's important for development but resides outside of the genome. Also, we agree with you guys. And I think that this is something where the third way evolution camp gets the credit for coming up with natural genetic engineering. It does shape organisms under stress. We find that very fascinating. We accept that. I think we want to see how far it can go, but we're open to looking at following the evidence, like you said.
The only qualification I'd put on that is that as I said earlier on, it doesn't have to do so in all the organisms in a species in one go. If it does so in a few, what you get is a variety which can then become the dominant set. That's exactly right, though. Otherwise, I suppose the reason I'm making this point is that natural genetic engineering, as it were, has, and I come to something that may be a disagreement, has a kind of design to shape organisms. That's where I wonder, is that the right language or not? It seems to me that it's often more like the immune system. But that analogy we can explore later if we want to.
I would love to explore that. And for now, I get totally what you're saying. And this is where there is a natural selection aspect to third way, where you can have large numbers of organisms in a population. You increase those probabilistic resources, but you just think that these sort of somatic hypermutations can maybe also happen not just in the immune system, but also in chromosomal rearrangements to give you something really new that can then, it only takes one and then, or maybe two, and then it can be selected in a population and proliferate and get fixed. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the Darwinian aspect, but we don't have to say Neo-Darwinian. We can say it's Darwin's way. Yeah. This is another area where I think that third way and ID both are really excited about systems biology. And organisms work because they function as integrated wholes. And organisms show a top-down design where parts exist to serve the whole. Now, I'm skeptical that ultimately the third way materialistic evolutionary view can account for why systems biology works so well and organisms really are integrated wholes. But I fully appreciate and recognize you guys are there. You're with this view, and we are on the same page with that. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything. Yeah, go ahead.
You've used the word materialistic a few times to describe third way. Define materialistic.
Sure. So I would say materialistic means that there's no forces other than basically earthbound processes that are governing the history of life. So what if you have an intelligent agent that resides outside of the earthbound system that comes in and adds information? Okay. And so whether this agent is an alien or a divine being or whatever you want to call it, I think that the third way evolutionary view does require only, and so I guess under this view, there is agency, but that agency is ultimately just the result of earthbound systems. And I could say that we're agents that are earthbound, result of forces that are occurring in nature, okay, natural material causes. I don't have a problem with that, but what if there is some intelligence from outside the system that's coming in and adding information? I don't think that third way evolution allows for that.
So
that's a very interesting point, Casey. Let me ask this in a slightly different way. What is an immaterial cause other than not material? Because it seems to me that our social interactions, and there is social selection, we can't surely deny that, is not totally materialistic, is it?
That's fair. It's not just force atoms bumping against each other. And I hear what you're saying there. There's definitely a higher order of interaction going on there. And I don't want to presume anything about your worldview, Dennis. I don't know where you're coming from worldview-wise.
My worldview is, I'm not quite sure that I know what it is. The last chapter of my book, Dance the Tune of Life, is entitled The Relativity of Epistemology, and that was chosen very carefully. Epistemology is what we know, and the relativity of what we know tells us we should be very cautious. I just think the key point here is that I think that what is or is not material, that's an interesting question. There could be a whole book on that issue. But it does seem to me that a lot of the way in which the purposive interactions of organisms occur, and therefore what I would call social selection, which is much similar to Darwin's sexual selection, his is just one form of it, inevitably incorporates non-material processes. If you want to call those spiritual, I don't mind, you see. Even Conrad Washington, who was not religious at all, used the word spiritual, and I think he meant it in that kind of sense. But look, these are just clarifications, not need to carry on.
No, I appreciate this. That's a great question you asked, Perry. I don't want to misuse terms here again or misdescribe anybody's views. I think you guys have made fair points, but I'm not saying that the opposite of materialistic is necessarily spiritual. I think that maybe what we could say is that third way evolution, everything that happens is confined within the biosphere. Okay, there's no external input of information from outside the biosphere.
Yes.
The biosphere is sufficient to evolve, and if that means that there are agent-based interactions that are non-material, that are guiding evolution in some cases, fine. But it's all contained within the biosphere. The biosphere is the universe where evolution happens.
That's a good definition of what ID means, isn't it?
I think ID would say it's not all biosphere-centric, that there's stuff outside the biosphere that has come in.
I think it's very important to clarify that. That's right.
I think ID itself contains a spectrum of views about what that does and doesn't mean, as well as the third way people have a spectrum of views. There are some ways of defining ID. So if you look at my evolution book, I reference a definition of ID that came off the Discovery Institute website 10 years ago or something. And it simply says that in order to explain biology, you need to incorporate elements of engineering and design and intention or something like that. And you could maybe call that a sort of agnostic intelligent design theologically. And then there's other versions of intelligent design that just believe in acts of miraculous creation. And I feel like between molecular interactions and God, there is a vast range of levels of abstraction and levels of agency. Like you could start with, does the number 7 exist? Or does X exist? Or does a differential equation exist? Or does a Euclidean space exist? And you can just keep going and going until eventually you get to, does an ultimate prime mover exist? And these questions are just incrementally more abstract. I don't personally see the ability to draw a hard line. I see a continuum. And so I'm saying this to hopefully just clarify the nuance that's in the issue rather than to drive a particular agenda.
You make some good points there, Perry. I'm actually writing a book right now that if I ever get power and opportunity to finish it, I'll do that. But it goes through the definition of intelligent design. Let's look at, maybe we can move to ID right now. And that would be a good segue, Perry, because what does ID say? I think that ID certainly does say, and I think that, is evolution, does the biosphere contain everything evolution needs to proceed? You're right, Perry. There's a big spectrum of views within the ID community. Sometimes we call ourselves a big tent in that regard, but we all agree with this statement here, that many features of living organisms are best explained by an intelligent cause because this should say they contain forms of information and complexity that in our experience come only from intelligence. That's the definition that I like to use. And now some people would say that information could come literally at the beginning of the universe, and then the universe unfolded. There was an intelligent agent outside the universe that set everything up to evolve. But others would say that there's a need for repeated inputs of information into the biosphere throughout the history of life. I'm definitely in the latter camp. Most of the folks I work with are also, but not necessarily all of them. I certainly have folks like Michael Denton, who likes to see initial fine-tuning of the universe, as that's a locus of design. And maybe he's agnostic about others. I don't want to speak for him. There's definitely a spectrum of views, but we all see that an input of information from an intelligent cause is really important. And
Can I comment?
Yeah.
I know a lot of third way people who would say that they think the universe is consciousness first, matter second. And so they could pretty much fit into that first bullet point. And once again, we're in very fine shades of gray because maybe that person might be a Buddhist or a Hindu, or they might be a theist, but either way, they see cause and effect in biology very differently than a Neo-Darwinist would.
That very well may be, Perry, and I think that we have Buddhists in our community. We have Buddhists in the ID community. We have folks from Eastern religious persuasions who see it the way you just described it. So I think that what you just said I think that's very fair, yeah. So, yeah, that's fine. If you believe that intelligence and the need really to account for the origin of information is really important in biology, and intelligence is the right explanation, either proximally or even ultimately, then that's getting you into the ID camp. And there could be some shades of gray here. And Dennis, I don't want to speak for anybody in particular. That may not be where you're coming from, and that's fine.
Just one other thought. These terms have become so politicized that, especially going back 5 to 20 years ago, that I think there's a lot of people who are mostly or even perfectly simpatico with the ID set of axioms, but they would be afraid to be identified with ID because they would get pigeonholed or they wouldn't get funding or somebody would call them out on social media. Let's hear from Dennis a little more.
Well, yes, in a sense, you're quite right. But that's because, to take that first point that Casey's raised, many features of living organisms are best explained by an intelligent cause because they're forms of information and complexity that in our experience only come from intelligence. Now, I would say the only problem I've got with that statement is I attribute that kind of intelligence to every organism on Earth.
Okay, that's fair. And so what we would say is, and I've read a lot about the algorithmic capabilities of organisms, from a bacterium to an elephant, to make choices.
It's phenomenal what they can do.
Yeah, it is. So, I agree with you.
Therefore, I say I agree with you. There's a big issue about how did the first organisms arise. A hell of an issue there. Now, there's even, of course, with the successors to people like Fred Hoyle, people who think that it may be that life actually came from another planet or somewhere from anywhere. The point I'm making, though, is that with that problem still obviously to be resolved, we've no difficulty in seeing how intelligence arises in an organism, because it's always developed from another organism, and we would give the characteristics of intelligence to all organisms. There may be a shade of difference amongst different third-way people in this. There's no dogma, as I said earlier on. But in principle, I know Jim Shapiro would certainly say a bacterium shows great intelligence. And if we attribute the word intelligence to artificial intelligence, for goodness sake, we must attribute it to a bacterium. So I would only say here that's not an issue for me, that particular statement, because I think the intelligent cause is life itself. Now, we have to still work out how life itself began. Absolutely agree. And that's an issue.
Yeah. So look, we do have a lot in common. And I think that a bacterium does have the ability to have some intelligence. From an ID perspective, and I'm going to speak right now for really a lot of folks that I work with very closely at Discovery Institute. Steve Meyer, Jonathan Wells, who just passed away, Brian Miller, Jonathan McClatchy, and some of my PhD scientist colleagues, Emily Reeves. We would say that the reason that a bacterium can show this kind of intelligence is because it has programming in it. And that programming allows it to make choices. It can receive inputs. If you're talking about chemotaxis, it can receive inputs from the environment. Oh, the food source signal is getting stronger as I go in this direction. And so then when it goes to the next tumble and roll, it will selectively prefer tumbles that cause it to swim in the direction of food. There's a biological sensory response mechanism at work that allows the bacterium to swim to food through this sort of stochastic tumble and roll process, which is really cool. But what we see there is really exquisite programming, sensors, control logic, algorithmic programming that allows a bacterium to make choices, to look intelligence. And that programming is calling out for an explanation. And we would say that when you see sensors and control logic, that is best explained by programming. That is best explained by intelligent design. And this is where I would say, can a massive chromosomal rearrangement generate this kind of complexity? Can it jump to the top of that cliff? Because when we look at these, the control logic of many regulatory systems in bacteria or eukaryotes or any organism for that matter, multiple components have to be there before they function. We would call that irreducible complexity. And feel free to disagree, Dennis. You may see it differently. That's totally fine. But we would say that it's very unlikely to produce the needed parts for these control logic intelligent systems to be able to function through some chromosomal rearrangement, something that really is a one-time event in biology. You need a lot of parts to suddenly show up in order to get these things to work. And this is where we see top-down design. We see integrated complexity through multiple parts. We sometimes call it irreducible complexity. All of the information, what all of these point to is a need for mass amounts of information to program these systems to work. And in our experience, that information always comes from intelligence, this programming. So this is what the ID argument is. You can feel free to disagree with it. And maybe if you do disagree, maybe this is a point of disagreement. I don't know.
It may be, but let's try to clarify that one. I'm going to be a bit shocking here. I don't think there is a program. Now, that may sound very shocking. And look, this is me, not necessarily representative of what other people in the third way might say about this. But when I look at the DNA sequence, I cannot find a program there. I'm a programmer, and I know what kinds of statements there have to be in programs. I've programmed many computer models of living cells. So I don't find a program in DNA. Do I find a program in the metabolic networks? There is the Krebs cycle, the tricarboxylic cycle. It shows that there is a process that goes all the way around the cycle, but I don't think it's programmed to do that. I think the program is the activity itself, and therefore there's no need for a separate program that causes the activity. So I'm going to be really quite fundamental on this. I terribly doubt whether the program model is the right model. Now that's strange coming from me, because I'm somebody who's programmed many biological processes and to simulate them on a computer. Yet I'm also saying I don't think an organism program. It doesn't need a separate program to program. What it does is what it does. And this is getting very, very deeply philosophical, and I understand that.
So I think I can unpack that a little. So
yeah.
I am very ID sympathetic. I am very close ID adjacent, let's call it. In fact, by some definitions, I'm totally an ID guy. So I'm ID sympathetic because I'm an engineer and I see all the things that Casey is describing. But there's a very fine distinction that I've become more and more aware of the deeper I've gone into biology, is I'd like to make a distinction between external programming, and let's use the word programming literally the way most humans understand it, that there is rigid Boolean logic and so on, versus the notion that life is gifted with agency. Programming and agency is a much higher level.
Exactly.
Because agency is choices.
Yes, exactly.
And here's a really good example. Michael Levin did an experiment where he put, I think it was tadpoles in barium, and barium is a channel blocker, and their heads exploded. And they immediately grew back new heads that were barium resistant. Immediately. We don't have any reason to believe that there's an evolutionary history of barium resistance that somehow was already programmed in or developed, or I don't know, I wouldn't even be inclined to think that God put it in there. I think it figured it out on the fly and engineered a novel situation that had never happened before in history, and it did it right the first time through its innate intelligence and agency. And that puts life at a much higher plane than anything humans make. And so what we're really wrestling with is, what is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of agency? What is the nature of cognition? And we don't even know, because nobody even knows how to define what consciousness is. And I think that's the fundamental question. And the reason that I would rather view agency as innate to the organism rather than something that's externally programmed is that if it's innate to the organism, I think that gives us a much better model for doing things like curing cancer or understanding how tumors grow and evolve and how to get them to stop and reverse and go back to their previous state. So I'm a Christian. I believe in God. But to me, when I'm practicing science, jumping to God, I avoid that as much as possible. And another reason why is because the more baked in it is, the more impressive of a design the universe is. The fewer acts of divine intervention I need in order to make the cosmos run, the more elegant the cosmos is. And so in a sense, I'm taking my own theory of ID even more seriously.
Could I chime in here, Perry? I appreciate your openness. I'll be transparent. Since we're all sharing where we're coming, I'm also a Christian. It's fine to get your biases out there. That's where I'm coming from in my personal worldview. And Dennis, I like the fact that you are always very clear. You don't want to have dogmas. And I like the fact that you're saying that there's no programming in the DNA. I think that's right. I think, however, that there is logical. This is like where Philip Ball says that life is not a machine, but it does contain machines. Life is not a computer, but there are computer-like elements sometimes. Yeah. So life is not just programming, but there can be things that resemble programming in life. Yeah.
I could not have programmed a reconstruction of part rhythm in 1960. Absolutely right. No, clearly there are, as I see it, the machine-like behavior can be used whenever it's automatic, and that's been recognized by physiologists for absolutely ages, of course.
No, that's great. That's great. And so I think that there is programming in life, but it's at a much higher level than the genome. And when you look at all of the post-transcriptional modifications that happen to an mRNA transcript and how all this is being done by both RNAs and proteins that are being created by the genome, there's so much going on, computation that's going on in a cell at a much higher level than just the genome. There's so much going on. It is dizzyingly complex, as Philip Ball says. And so there is control logic there. We can very easily understand the control logic of the lac operandi. When lactose is absent, there is a repressor that binds to the chromosome and prevents the RNA polymerase from transcribing the genes that you need to metabolize, the enzymes you need to metabolize lactose. And when lactose is present, the repressor releases, and you can then transcribe and translate those genes. There is control logic all throughout biology. In fact, what's amazing to me is that we find similar logical structures in gene regulation throughout system to system. Different genes have often very similar control logic. Control logic is everywhere in biology, but it's happening, there is programming there, but it's at a much higher level than just, the readout from the DNA. Heck no, as I've learned this from you. There's so much happening in your camp. There's so much happening in the genome. Control, regulation, programming at a much higher level than just the DNA. And what this points to me is massive amounts of information and regulation and control. For me as an idea theorist, I get really excited about this because I see that intelligent agents produce information at multiple levels of hierarchy that interact, that coordinate with one another to control systems. This, to me, points to an intelligent cause being behind all of this, because in all of our experience, when we see integrated forms of information and control and regulation and hierarchical information that interacts with each other at different levels to control systems, that in our experience, our uniform repeated experience, always comes from intelligence. I think also that we do need to be careful about just how much can these amazing new forms of natural genetic engineering do. Perry, that's a cool example of barium resistance. I like that. But I do also want to caution us a little bit here. There's a really cool example that Philip Ball cites in his book, and I think, Dennis, you've talked about this, where they basically knocked out some of the regulatory genes that help a flagellum to grow. This is a paper from Science from a few years back, and the flagellum, the bacterium, re-evolved the ability to grow flagella. How did they do this? It wasn't like they suddenly re-evolved all of the genes.
They didn't actually show genetic mutations that removed or damaged the ability to make flagella. They found mutations that occurred that brought back the control processes that enabled the flagella to be used. You're quite right. It's most improbable that in a few days any bacterium population could generate all the complex machinery for generating flagella from scratch. That is not what they did. And this was incidentally a very major argument at the Royal Society meeting between me and Shuker in the audience, because he said, Dennis, the paper you've cited, which is precisely this paper, shows mutations. It's Neo-Darwin selection, isn't it? I said, no, you haven't understood what I've said. It is that you have to go to a higher level of organization to understand what those organisms did. They didn't lack the mechanism of flagellae, they lacked part of the control process. Now, I come back to the central question, which I will keep returning to, I think, in this. Why do we have to say there's a separate program at all?
Can I just speak to the flagellum issue? You're absolutely right. They didn't, I definitely was not trying to say that they somehow lost the genes for building flagella and then they re-evolved those. What you said is absolutely right. In fact, my colleague Jonathan McClatchy has written about this on Discovery Institute's website, Evolution News, that what they did was they deleted the master flagellar switch protein. I think it's FLEQ in a species of bacteria. And they found that after a few days, they reacquired that ability. How did they do that? They found another master switch protein that from a different system called NTRC that was involved in nitrogen metabolism. And it's a very...
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Exactly. You've got it right. Yes. Yes, that's my recollection of the paper too. It's a few years since I read the paper, but that's my recollection.
You got it right. You didn't nobody from your camp is ever misrepresenting this paper as far as I've seen. I just want to point out, though, that what they found basically was that there was a structurally similar homologue to the master switch protein for turning the flagellar assembly growth on. And so they were able to find a very similar protein that could do the same thing. That's cool. I like that. I'd love to see us explore how evolution can do these things. But I also don't want us to overstate the ability of natural genetic engineering, what it can do here. I'm not saying anybody's doing that. I would like to know at the molecular level what happened with that barium. I think we're all in agreement. We want to follow the evidence where it leads. This is cool. This story about finding a master switch gene that can turn on the assembly of flagella. But from an ID perspective, this doesn't seem like it's out of the realm of what evolution can do to find a structurally similar homologue to suddenly fill in the gap and perform the same, just turning on or off this system kind of function. I think that's cool, but that doesn't mean that we can evolve things like flagella. So that's key questions that we want to ask. So anyway, you asked a question, Dennis, about programming. Do you want to restate that? Because I think you were taking the conversation in a good direction.
Well,
I'd love to hear what you had to say.
It's actually a fundamental question for me. As I look at a computer when it's running a program, I have on the one hand the program, which is a set of instructions that I may have written myself, or somebody has. And then there is the machinery that the computer then uses to do things. That's the analogy there in the organism would be the various proteins that actually do the work, that contract or move this way or open channels here and so on. So you've got, on the one hand, a set of operators that can enable this thing to happen, that thing to happen, and you've got a program that programs to do that. Now, as I see it, the machine in this case is the organism, which is the program, which is the function. And so I ask the question, why do we need a separate program? I don't know whether that makes sense.
I'm not nearly even remotely the biologist that you are, Dennis. So you have a much deeper understanding of how organisms work than I do. But it's my sense that there is informational control at different levels of an organism. You can have very high level control, and then you can have mid-level control, and then you have the nuts and bolts control.
And higher levels as being the programs for the lower levels.
I think at some point agency is, you're absolutely right. Like we get excited about talking about agency is
a terribly difficult issue of what is agency. I absolutely agree. Yes.
Yeah. But there's multiple levels. I don't know if I can say that an organism's a bacteria's chemotaxis system that allows it to swim in the direction of food, that's the same as the kind of agency the bird has when it's building its nest, or that a crab has when it's using its pincher to go and grab food. I think that frankly, I do think that what's going on in the bacterium is mechanistic. We can explain it in terms of key Y methylates this and that in the system, and that's how chemotaxis works. I don't think that we need to appeal to an intelligence like we experience intelligence to explain that.
So I think that if you look at Barbara McClintock's work and the transposons and the Nobel Prize paper and all that, there is a clear distinction between things that are already pre-programmed, like an SOS response, and that's a very large category of behavior. Okay, it's already got a program for this. It's much like human behavior. We get out of bed and we get in the shower, and mostly we're just running a program. We're not really thinking very hard about what we're doing. But then there are novel events which have no precedent, for which the organism is unprepared, and it goes into a different mode of operation, and it comes up with something. And what it comes up with is not predictable from what came before. Plant galls are unique to each combination of insect and plant produces a different outcome. And if you went and got some species of worm and some species of plant that had never been together, they will generate a new response that's never happened in history. And I feel like all of the AI programs, the ability of AI to sound like a human, it shows you that 90% of what humans do is just pre-programmed responses with an occasional choice here and there. But this is how evolution works too. And so agency occurs at many different levels. Programs occur at many different levels. And I think one of Dennis's great contributions is the observation there is no single privileged level of causation. They all flow with one another, which is an extremely useful way of understanding the body and, for that matter, businesses and human systems and all kinds of other things. And one of the cautions that I have about saying, if you say that the intelligence of organisms is strictly limited to only be able to do certain things, and more than that requires an external spiritual source, I'm not sure how you can be sure. Doesn't a scientist have to give the organism the benefit of the doubt in order to keep science?
Yeah. So I think that, as Dennis has very aptly said, we should follow the evidence where it leads. And so I'm all for exploring what natural genetic engineering can do. I love your idea, Perry, to expose organisms to novel situations and see what they come up with. I would love to see I think we're in the early stages of investigating this newly discovered phenomenon. And of course, we will follow the evidence where it leads. But ID does predict, and not dogmatically. It's okay in science to make a prediction, and maybe your prediction works out, maybe it doesn't. ID does predict, I think, on good basis, that there are limits to how much things can evolve. The reason that we use drug cocktails in fighting cancer or in fighting antibiotic resistance is because we know that if we give too many targets that a system has to evolve resistance to, it's not going to be able to do it. We use this principle that there are limits to evolution all the time. And so I think that we need to follow the evidence where it leads. Because, Perry, let me just say this one last thing. When we invoke intelligent design, and this is where we probably disagree, and that's okay. We are not stopping doing science at that point. We are actually using our uniform and repeated experience that information, control, regulation, coordinated systems that have information at different levels that are working together towards a whole, just like Dennis says. I love the way he describes biology. And in all of our experience, when we see systems like that coming into existence, they always come from intelligence. So every time we invoke design, it's not because of what we don't know. It's not God of the gaps. It's because we know from our experience that this is what intelligent agents generate. This is what they do. Go ahead, Perry.
So what you said about cancer is exactly why we're not curing cancer. Cancer cells can out-evolve any mechanistic attempt to stop them.
I thought some people get cured.
The only level at which you're ever going to cure cancer is at the agential level. Because this is why stage 4 is almost always hopeless.
Yeah, once it's spread, obviously, but you can treat it, and some people do get cured. It does work sometimes. Obviously, if it's already proliferated, it's too late. I get it. You can't kill all those cells fast enough.
It works sometimes at early stages because sometimes a mechanistic approach will work. But this is precisely the problem with cancer, is that every cell in your body is intelligent, and when they go rogue and they no longer consider themselves a part of your body, they will do anything to evolve, and they can and they will. And cancer is exactly where you can test the limits of evolution. And it has almost unlimited capacity to come up with resourceful solutions. That's why stage 4 is almost always fatal.
So, Perry, actually, I agree with you that cancer is an interesting model for understanding evolution. There was actually just a paper that came out in the Journal of Molecular Evolution a couple days ago titled Survey for Activating Oncogenetic Mutation Variants in Metazone Germline Genes. And what this paper finds is basically that cancer operates like evolution, Darwinian evolution. Things are basically trying to evolve the ability to replicate out of control, and there's competition with cells that aren't cancerous, et cetera, et cetera. What they found, though, is that when you evolve this ability to basically replicate out of control, that is the result of breaking inhibitory mechanisms. They say that capriciously detailed molecular modeling studies have revealed that these mutations technically result in loss of functions inherent in each protein, namely inhibitory mechanisms to deactivate each enzyme have been thwarted. So this is kind of like Michael Behe's Darwin evolves thesis, that yes, natural selection does happen, but it happens by breaking things and diminishing function at the molecular level. So yes, cancer can do a lot of crazy things, but it's not evolving new functions. It's breaking things at the molecular level. And to the extent that cancer works, it's not evolving new complex features like whatever you want to call it, flagella, irreducibly complex control systems. It is breaking features at the molecular level. That's the message of this paper that somebody just sent it to me this morning.
So I significantly disagree with that, and I could show you a lot of paper. So cancer many times starts when a cell of an organ like a kidney or a pancreas does a symbiotic merger with an immune cell, and it does it in real time, and the combination is called a polyploid giant cancer cell, and cancer cells use chromothripsis and chromoplexy and all of the tools of natural genetic engineering, and they do create new structures. Now, it's chaotic, and it's not organized in the same way that the body is, but they're working together to fool the immune system. They're sending signals. So it's a separate intelligent agent in the body. It's a separate organism evolving to consume all of the resources, and it's evolving in the third way sense, not just the traditional Darwinian sense. And that's why evolution is the key to cancer.
I agree with you that evolution is the key to cancer. The guy who wrote the paper I just cited is actually a friend of mine. He was a former high-level manager of cancer research at the NIH, actually, and he's fully on board with Michael Behe's Darwin Evolves thesis. He sent me his paper because he sees cancer primarily as breaking controls at the molecular level. Now, I'm open to hearing about cool things that can happen. If natural genetic engineering can do interesting things, by all means, let's explore it. I'm not against that. I want to follow the evidence where it leads. I guess from an ID perspective, we're just skeptical how far it can go. We think that what natural genetic engineering is doing is it's often basically tuning pre-existing features along predefined axes that allow for rapid and pre-programmed additional abilities, pre-programmed evolution that allow organisms to rapidly adapt to situations that they might encounter. We're really excited about this. I think that even convergent evolution may result from pre-programmed adaptive capacities that are in different organisms that allow them to respond in similar ways to different environmental systems in different situations. So I do think that there's a lot to learn from this, no doubt. I think that it's a little bit premature to say that this explains how all the complex regulatory architecture and algorithmic control we see in biology can arise. I think that the fitness landscapes, the cliffs are too high for any macro mutation to do it. This is the ID perspective. But of course, we want to follow the evidence where it leads, and if the evidence is there, fine. But we haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
Your thoughts, Dennis?
I want to suggest something before we get to the witching hour, which I think is a few minutes away, which is, Casey, if you can share that Venn diagram that you've got to send to me, that would be very helpful, because I'm seriously interested in going through the lower part of your diagram, which we didn't have time here to do, and I'd be very happy to do that. And if we need to have another discussion, that's also fine, because I sense we didn't really go around that part of your diagram. But that's just to say it would be good to have that, if you're happy with that.
I'm very happy to share with you, provided that you give me critical feedback and tell me where I'm wrong.
That would be the point, because I have no interest in using it for any other purpose than giving you some critical feedback. I like engagement in discussion. And what I find very disappointing in the behavior of let's call them the orthodox evolutionary biologists, because they also, when you go through it, they are also a vast range. A lot of them think nothing of Dawkins and his interpretation of Neo-Darwinism. A lot of them are escaping as rapidly as they can from some of the constraints that seemed to have been there ever since the 1960s, when Julian Huxley wrote the second edition of his book, which incidentally is vastly more restrictive than the first edition in 1942. If the 1942 modern synthesis was still there to be debated, we'd only have two things to change: sexual selection, which they never agreed with, and the fact that there is no Weissman barrier. Once you've removed those two, you're almost in third-way territory. But Julian Huxley accepted the central dogma of molecular biology as prohibiting, effectively, any kind of transmission down through the generations, and prohibiting any other form than a genetic interpretation of how organisms work. That was the big disaster. But as I said, there's a range. But what I find common amongst them is their unwillingness to come and discuss. The reason I love what we're doing now is, although we've got possible deep fundamental differences, we're happy to discuss it. They won't. Do they ask anybody from Third Way to come to the meetings that they organise? Never. What did we do at the 2016 meeting? Two absolutely card-carrying fundamental neo-Darwinists, or modern synthesis, called what you will, were there to give presentations at the meeting. We had no hesitation in making sure that there were people to represent what we were criticising. But will they come to anything that we put on? Actually, initially, they refused to come to the Royal Society meeting in 2016. It's a very complicated story. Let's not worry with that. But I find this kind of discussion, which is probing where we agree, where we disagree, or where we're doubtful, where the fuzziness is, extremely helpful. And that's, I hope, the way science should advance.
Dennis, I'm honored and grateful to be able to have had this conversation with you. And Perry, I'm same feelings towards you for organizing it. Dennis, we both of our friends, communities have been on the receiving end of I think the power that the Neo-Darwinian community exercises and exerts over biology and not letting people think outside their box. And I love this quote. This is my favorite quotes ever was from Kevin Leyland et al.'s paper in Nature in 2014, where they were debating, does Neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory need a rethink? And they said, perhaps haunted by the specter of intelligent design, evolutionary biologists wish to show a united front to those hostile to science. And I have no idea if Kevin Leyland reads Evolution News, which is our website. But the funny thing is that I said something very similar about 3 years before they published their paper. And when I was reviewing Jim Shapiro's book, and I said, perhaps the specter of intelligent design is haunting Shapiro as he makes his case to other scientists because his explanation for YAD, blah, blah, blah. So basically, I think that people are afraid of larger implications here. Clearly, though, the third way people are not, because Kevin Leyland and his team and you and many others are willing to have these conversations. And I really admire and appreciate the folks who are willing to put their careers at risk. And maybe for somebody like you, I note that you and Shapiro are far along in your careers where it's tough for them to do anything to you. There are a lot of folks in our camp, young up-and-coming scientists, who are very friendly to intelligent design, who are scared to death, and are also very actually interested in third-way ideas as well. We love to talk about these things, but they're scared to death to come out of the closet, so to speak. And we have literally hundreds of young PhD scientists and also established PhD scientists in our community who are scared to death to be public about their views. And I think this is not a good, healthy state for the scientific community, but major kudos to you and your friends who are trying to bring communication and restore the ability to follow the evidence where it leads. I have nothing but thanks for you, Dennis, and the work you've done in that regard, and we owe a lot to you. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm happy to do this conversation anytime with you and Perry and anybody else, and we can go over the ID portion, and you can tell me where I'm wrong. I want more of that.
Brilliant. I like all of that, and I'm very happy. I will, if you send me that Venn diagram, I will indeed do what I can within the limited time I have left nowadays.
I understand.
Another problem. I was lecturing to India yesterday. Only a week or two ago I was doing something. I can't remember now. It doesn't matter. But the main reason I'd like to go through it is precisely to provide some critical feedback. Terrific.
Cheers.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for organizing it, Perry.
Bye.
Bye-bye.